and welcome to another episode of Dear Jane. I'm your host, Marcy Little, with my co-host, Scott Baker. Scott, how's it going?
It's going well. Glad to be here.
Good. I'm excited about today's conversation. We have John Stonestreet back with us today. He's the president of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, does a daily podcast and radio show called Breakpoint. He just has a really great way of helping us all think about our current cultural moment, which if you're on social media or watch the news even a little bit, you know, is quite an interesting cultural moment. So we're excited to jump into the conversation with him today. But before we do that, Scott, can you please tell us about today's sponsor of the show, Cogency Strategic?
Absolutely. So a lot of political battles this year in some key states dealing with the issue of life. And it's really, really significant. In some of these states, they're trying to enshrine unlimited, unrestricted abortion into state constitutions. That's the result of Dobbs. So it's important that we win. It's imperative that we win these races. And Cogency Strategic can help you win these races, help you communicate the message that is necessary to get voters to understand really what's at stake. Cogency Strategic can do it in a way where they can do very targeted, strategic messaging in a way, kind of, quite frankly, that the other side does. I mean, the other side is really sophisticated, and they've done a great job. And it's time for the pro-life movement to do that, and Cogency can help you do that. So whether you're an organization that has a fight this fall, or maybe you're gearing up for one next year in the coming years, because the other side has made it clear they're going to go to every state in the union. Cogency Strategic can help you reach voters and make sure that you can win these important fights for life. So make sure you visit them at cogencystrategic.com.
Yeah, definitely be sure to check them out. They have amazing results and just will do a great job with your campaign. So definitely recommend them. All right, let's jump into today's conversation. John, thanks so much for joining us again on Dear Jane.
Great to be back with you.
Yeah. So the last time we talked, we were talking about, the inconsequential Supreme Court ruling in the state of Alabama about IVF. And since then, nothing newsworthy has really happened. So.
It's been so boring. We live in such a boring cultural moment.
Really had to scrape the bottom of the barrel to come up with stuff to talk about today. No, unfortunately, that's not true. So I'd love to just dive in. At the time of this recording, man, the last few weeks we've seen the GOP change their platform to gut a lot of their previous pro-life stances. We've seen sort of wishy-washy pro-life candidate designated for VP on the Republican side. Now, more recently, we're seeing shenanigans at the Democrat National Convention with the selection of Tim Walz as Vice President Harris's presidential running mate. How should Christians be thinking about all of this?
Well, I think, Christians need to think about it, I think, in particular ways. But can I start with how Americans need to think about it? And that is that this really is in the wake of the Dobbs decision. So the Supreme Court didn't settle the issue of abortion with Roe. It didn't settle the issue with Dobbs. And so what we have now is basically the downstream effect of of a reality that politics is not the only aspect of culture. It is an aspect of culture. A lot of people talk about Chuck Colson used to talk about politics being downstream from culture, and I think politics is downstream from the rest of culture, but politics is part of culture as well. But there's a whole lot of things impacting the way we're thinking and talking and legislating and reporting on and making personal decisions on this really critical issue that involves human beings and how we think about human value. So the Dobbs chaos continues, and I'm thankful for Dobbs, very thankful for Dobbs. Roe was terrible, but Dobbs didn't settle it either, and so I think that's the first and most obvious thing, and it's really taken root in the two political parties now, because it has. What we've seen is that on the political right, this is, at least for those in control of the party and determining the Republican platform, the Republican agenda, this is a pragmatic issue. This is not a principled issue. When it was winnable, or when it was something that would help them win, they would all in. And now that it doesn't seem like it's a popular issue, they're backpedaling like crazy. There's no other way to see it. Now the Dems, they are running into this full bore. Now, whether that's out of pragmatic, they think the louder they are, the better it is for them or not. That's a great question. No idea. I think for some of them, there's a real commitment. True believers that abortion is health care, and some of the other slogans that we'll hear from the stage of the Democratic National Convention with cheers. And what that denotes is that the days of safe, legal, and rare are long gone. In fact, look, that was Clinton's platform, right? Safe, legal, and rare. That's now the Republican platform, basically, is that we want access to mifepristone. Women need this. We want access to IVF, even though that leads to more aborted embryos than the surgical abortion procedure does. And we want states to be able to choose. So basically, the Republicans are now the party of pro-choice. They've put the choice at the state level instead of the individual level. But even as they talk about it, both President Trump and the nominee, J.D. Vance, have said now it's up to the voters. And what they mean is the voters can influence the state. So they're now wanting people to choose. The Dems have not been the party of choice for a while. Abortion has been the positive, good choice that they have advanced and promoted. And now, not only with Kamala Harris, who's by far the most pro-abortion candidate that we've ever seen in American history on either side of the political aisle, and nobody else comes close. And her running mate, who has proudly, I think he said Nancy Pelosi had told him to back off a little bit his pro-abortion stance. But I mean, what are you talking about? And even more than that, the associated issue with this is that what's being done about families. So the Republican platform is also softened on the definition of marriage and the significance of the home, which is the only way to be pro-child is to be pro-family. If you want to be anti-child poverty, if you want to be pro-child education, if you want to be for children and against the things that are bad for children, you're for the family. And the Republicans have basically staked their claim on that. They've softened that way back now in this platform to the point that the pro-gay aspect of the party has celebrated that. And, of course, these two candidates on the left have gone all in on the deconstruction of the family to the extent of the deconstruction of men and women. So Kamala Harris's first campaign stop was a drag show. The governor of Minnesota has been among the most aggressive, pushing in LGBTQ ideology into schools at children. So this is the most anti-family, anti-child campaign or ticket that we have ever seen. And again, nothing else even resembles this. It is by far. But other than that, it's all good news.
Oh yeah, we're okay. Other
than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how was the play?
Yeah.
It's
so. But here's the thing, John, and I agree with everything you just said. My concern is whether we're talking about the abortion issue or whether we're talking about any other cultural issue. Like, for example, you made the point on abortion on how what once was the quote-unquote liberals' point of view is now the quote-unquote conservative point of view. So whether we're talking about evangelicals or not even people of faith, I think there's a lot of people out there who be like, what's the point?
Yeah.
What's the point? And, that might sound weird for, three of us who follow this stuff regularly, and probably most of our listeners who follow this regularly, but there is tremendous apathy. We've seen it in the pro-life vote among evangelicals, for example. So I guess that's my big concern is there's a big segment of the population, no matter how you want to define that, who are just like, you know what, the writing's on the wall already. What's the point?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say that narrative came up multiple times in the decades before the Dobbs decision overturned Roe, that there's no hope, there's no point. I tell people, my experience is going to the March for Life in D.C. in January and what was probably 2015. I can't remember the exact year. If anybody who was there remembers it, because the mood was bleak. I mean, there was no sense in which anybody really thought that Trump was going to win the White House. Hillary Clinton seemed like a shoo-in. We knew that what that meant for the Supreme Court. We knew what that meant for the future of pro-abortion rights being enforced by the court, an activist court in these areas and so on. And there was a 2.5-foot snowstorm barreling down on D.C. Literally, people marched in the snow and tried to get out, and hardly anybody did. And then the very next year was when Vice President Pence showed up. President Trump did a video for it. The mood was completely different. And so the emotional swings of thinking that this issue is settled to it's not settled, that's been repeatedly taken place in the history, at least of Roe v. Wade. And so again, Dobbs didn't settle it, but Roe didn't settle it, and so there was work to be done, and now there's still work to be done. So I think the first thing it should do is not compromise whether or not we're convicted about when life begins and what our responsibility is to love our neighbors, preborn neighbors and those who are supposed to love them. That should make us double down. It should make us, I think, a little bit more aware of two things. Number one is of the political realities on the ground and what we can expect and not expect from politics. And number two is the limits of politics and where politics fits in the larger conversation. And when we back off even to a higher view than just the life issue, and I think the life issue is by far the most important issue, and should be determinative across the board. But there's a bigger problem in American society of politics taking all the air out of the room as it is, right? When everything is politicized in some way or another. I mean, we saw this, I don't know that we want to timestamp this particular conversation, but this week on Monday, there was a 1,000-point drop in the Dow, and the NASDAQ went through one of the bigger drops. And there was a whole lot of panic, and immediately people turned around and blamed Republicans, or this is the Kamala Harris, this is a result of the Kamala Harris announcement and her campaign. And I had David Bahnsen, a brilliant economist, talked to him just this morning for an episode of our podcast. And he was like, nah. It has nothing to do with those things. But the thought that everything turns around and rests on who's in the White House is just fundamentally wrong. And so I think we need to be kind of clear-eyed about the limits of politics and not expect, as Chuck Colson said, for salvation to come in Air Force One. It won't, and it will not on this issue. And by the way, neither does the apocalypse. Everything doesn't rest on the top office in the land. When we live in a cultural setting in which politics sucks so much air out of the room, that means that there's not enough emphasis being put on family and on churches and on institutions of civil society. And so we need to be politically active, and I know that's part two of this question, is why should we vote then? Why should we care about this election if we're choosing between a pro-choice party now and a pro-abortion party? Well, I think we need to, because politics is an area of life over which Christ is Lord. Politics is an area of life that still has incredible consequences for an awful lot of people, including the preborn children that we're trying to save. So we're going to have to, as Ryan Anderson put it years ago on a number of things, we're going to have to walk and chew gum at the same time. We're going to have to do the political stuff and the extra political stuff. And politics still matters greatly. We just need to have it's kind of like what this whole thing has done is given us a map with that yellow arrow that says you are here. And we need to be really clear on, what is the landscape we're dealing with. It isn't the 90s. It isn't, Clinton's safe, legal, and rare. And it's not, Reagan's protection of unborn life. And it isn't, it just isn't what it was. So we need to know where we're at.
So a follow-up to that would be, you mentioned earlier that the life issue is the most important issue, and I think the other side would agree with that. They think abortion is a winning issue for them. But in the grand scheme of things, really, where do you think this issue is on the priority list for the average voter?
I think for the average voter, it does matter if you're on the left or on the right. I think many voters on the right wish it would go away, and they're not willing to go further than what's already been done to state claims on this. I think part of that is that, maybe a better word even, and I think you're right when you describe kind of the setting as one of apathy. Another is of relativism. There is this sense where, yeah, I don't like it, but I don't want to actually tell somebody else that it would be wrong to get an abortion. I don't want to remove that option from my own child or my own, sister or whatever else it is. And so there's a little bit of situational ethics that have, shaded all of this. I think, we've oftentimes throughout the history of this whole conversation talked about the exceptions of rape and incest in the life of the mother. And I think, honestly, most people want the exception, and, another exception, which is whatever my case is. My case gets an exception. And I think that is probably the thing that's shading this. And if you were to ask me what's the one thing we've learned in this whole process is that we're thoroughly going moral relativist, and especially on these really important issues, and especially when it comes to anything having to do with sex.
You mentioned earlier Christ ruling over politics and ruling over all of these things. What would be your advice to people as we're getting into ramped up political campaigns? Emotions are running high, tensions are running high. How do we keep our wits about us and not go crazy in this headline-driven cultural moment where we're tempted to despair every day?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a choice that every Christian has in every sort of context, which is keeping straight the story in the moment. The moment is the chaos. We live in a huge cultural moment. I'm not saying this to undermine or to downplay the seriousness of the conversations we're having. Os Guinness has called this a civilizational moment in the same sense as some of the great civilizations meeting these kind of teetering moment of it can go this way or this way. And most, by the way, go into the dustbin of history in this super long decadent decline. And I think he's right in that analysis. I don't think you can have, such a significant shift in both explicit and implicit cultural realities that fail to take into account the consequence of behavior that are so built around living for immediate gratification in the moment and separating our actions from their natural consequences and think it's not going to have a civilizational impact. History tells us that that's always what happens. Civilizations that can think about the future do well. Civilizations that don't think about the future don't do well. I mean, it's really that simple if you look at some of the great sociological analysis. And of course, that has to do with structures of, what do you do with marriage and what do you do with family and what do you do with children? What do you do with the sexual instinct? What do you do with economic, engines and economic safe gaps and, things like that. And I think that's, we're at that moment. So I think the moment's super, super, super serious. But every moment is just that. It's a moment. There's a larger story for people of faith that they've been given in Scripture. If you're a Christian and you read the Bible in bits and pieces, or you read it for moral advice or how to get to heaven when you die, as opposed to this overarching framework of reality in which it describes where history's headed, it describes what's true about the human person, and all of it is centered on the work and the resurrection of Christ as the thing that secures history. Now, all of a sudden, the conversation is different because you have a larger story to put this kind of moment of crisis in. It's kind of like if you watch the first Lord of the Rings movie or read the first book, and you're like, man, I quit on this series because they killed Gandalf, and Gandalf's awesome. He remember he dies on that bridge in the cave. And
Spoiler alert. If
anybody doesn't know, sorry.
Hasn't known the story.
But of course, the whole story is he comes back, and there's a bigger story at work, and that's really kind of how Christians, I think, need you need to think about life in the world. But it requires that we're grounded in the story of Scripture, what we would call a Christian worldview, and not grounded in the chaos of the moment or the uncertainty or the postmodern impulse or the deconstruction, relativistic, referential, way of thinking about life in the world. And then that gives you a way to understand a moment. And you can't understand the whole story from the moment. You can only understand the moment from the story. And I think that's the thing that has to keep us straight. And I always go back to something that Father Newhouse wrote in an article years and years ago in First Things when he was alive. He was the founder of First Things, Richard John Newhouse. And he said it really simply. He said, the Christian has not right to despair because despair is a sin, and a Christian has not reason to despair because Christ is risen. And, when you think that that's not just something that I personally believe, but it actually is the centerpiece of all of history, and that's what I believe, now all of a sudden I think you have solid ground, to kind of go on. And maybe aren't so, dependent on a culture that certainly is schizophrenic in terms of can give you lots of reason to despair. But, you're exactly right. I mean, I mentioned earlier the conversation I had with David Bonson. It's just super, front and center on my mind because it just happened this morning. But, we don't talk a lot about economics on our program. We should. I should know more than I do. It's, above my pay grade. And I know there are basic economic realities that depend on this view of the human person versus that view of the human person. Certainly. But, what you see is something like that happens. Like what happened on Monday. We had a big sell-off of stocks and a significant drop of 1,000 points in the market and a bigger drop in the NASDAQ. And the panic was palpable. And it was palpable. Now, was it significant? Sure, economically. As he put it, this doesn't even fit into top 100 moves in the stock market. Not even the top 100. Definitely not the top 10, but not the top 100. And you say, well, man, if we're that skittish. Yeah. And we are, though. I mean, think about it. I was talking, recently with a COO who had implemented a particular hiring software and was doing some baseline work for the organization that he leads, and found out that all the millennials in his organization were super high on the anxiety level, Gen Zers as well. Mm-hmm. And you look at it and you go, he said, was this an anomaly? And the person who provided the software said, no, absolutely not. There's such a high level of anxiety in this generation. And the emerging generations. And I think that tells you a lot about whether or not we're grounded in the story or, getting shot around by the chaos. Yeah. And there's chaos, don't get me wrong.
What thoughts, advice, guidance would you have? I know one of the biggest concerns we have in the pro-life area is when it comes to time for a vote, people say, you know what, this isn't the precise language I would support, so I'm not voting for it. Or in the case of a candidate, I only agree with 85% of this candidate, and so I'm not voting for him. What is a better way to approach that?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. I think that is what a lot of people are feeling. And I imagine even after, I owe that framing of the parties of now we have a pro-choice party and a pro-abortion party to an article in First Things. And it was pretty stunning when I read it. I thought, he's right, but I don't like that. That's uncomfortable because then it says, well, what am I going to do? And I think that's a real challenge. I mean, I think, we have a candidate on one side who during his last term was very consequential for the life movement and has not just signaled, but very clearly articulated this ain't where he's going this time. I mean, he hasn't been obscure about this. He hasn't been shady. He has been very, very clear. This is what I believe. He's done it a number of times in a number of speeches. And if we have kind of tied our, cultural hopes to the political leadership that he could provide on that, we need to change our strategy. That's pretty clear. So what do we do? I have gone back a number of times to a framing of a from a former colleague of mine, Kevin Bywater. Kevin's a wonderful thinker, has led various programs for Summit Ministries in the past, and he has a good way of sometimes really bringing a framework to bear on a really interesting question. And this is one of them. And he basically responded to the thing that's most commonly said, which is now we have to choose between the lesser of two evils. I don't want to choose between the lesser of two evils. I remember a theological mentor of mine saying something along those lines where he's like, I can't ever remember voting for someone. I usually vote against someone else. And, really talking about the candidates themselves. And I think part of that was possible because there was such a very clear distinction between the parties. I think there was on some of these really, really important issues. I think there was kind of a baseline of how people lived and acted and talked, and a lot of that stuff's been broken over the past couple years. There was still areas on sexuality and gender and marriage that were too far for either party, and that's not the case anymore. So his framework is, rather than talking about the lessening the lesser of two evils and choosing between the lesser of two evils, talk about what choice would lessen evil. Now, it says a lot when you're basically voting, not really expecting to advance good, but only to lessen evil. And I kind of feel that way. But I think it's a helpful framework. I think it's especially helpful in the American context because the lesser of two evil framework really does probably put more weight on the presidential office than it merits. I mean, we do have a system that with checks and balances where the power of individuals is limited. That's not to say that the presidential office is not really important, because it really is. But it's actually most important not because of the power he holds, but because of the 3,000 to 5,000 other people that come along in any administration and hold an incredible amount of power over very specific ways of interpreting already existing law. I mean, what the Department of Education has done on Title IX, what the Department of Justice has done in interpreting the Constitution, what the Health and Human Services has done on interpreting Title VII and Title IX and all the other titles having to do with civil rights legislation and so on. It's really stunning. It feels almost dizzying. I mean, look, we're not talking about a recent conversation. Back in 2008, President Obama's Department of Health and Human Services wanted to make a bunch of nuns give abortifacients and contraceptives and pay for it, and would sue them. It took them to court multiple times over this, and then started states doing it. And that tells you, this isn't the president, but this is who comes along with the president. And so when I can do that calculation and go, which of these two choices will lessen evil, I think that actually is helpful. I think it also is a helpful framework because it doesn't put too much weight on politics itself, but it acknowledges that politics plays a particular role, but there's other things as well. And in other words, we can lessen the evil done by the political sphere and then continue to work in the other sphere. And I think that helps as well. And it also helps us remember that a significant duty when it comes to voting. I might not like what's happening at the top of the ticket, but there's an awful lot happening down ballot. We've seen an incredible shift in the last, 2 election cycles and who's populating school boards. And that's had very real impact on very real children and what they're being forced or what they're not being forced. You have very interesting things happening at the school board level all across America. And that has held back some of the evil that was put into the systems that became evident during the COVID lockdowns and the school board meetings in Loudoun County and other places. So I think we have a political responsibility to be engaged as citizens because we have the opportunity to be engaged. So it's a stewardship question. James puts it pretty starkly. If you know the good that you can do and you don't do it, it's sin. Is there good that we can do through politics? Yeah. So we should do it. Is it ultimate? No, the ultimate thing is going to be what happens in your house, not what happens in the White House. And we need to keep that together. And by the way, I think what's happening at state houses, really, really important.
Yep.
And that, of course, as we saw that in the wake of Dobbs, just immediately we went to a nation of pro-life states and pro-abortion states. We're going into a nation of pro-children states and anti-children states. We're going into a nation of, pro-crime and pro-law states. I mean, the divide is pretty stark. And so we can do good in politics, and we have to think about it, I think, more holistically. So I like that framework. It's been helpful for me, and I think it can help us think through the realities while still being sober-minded. We might look and go, well, the party I, whose basket I put my eggs in ain't what I thought they were. But now sober-minded with that "you are here" kind of moment, I can then, make a decision and calculate in the right way.
Mm-hmm. I think you made a really good point that it's good for people to remember, especially in a presidential election year, and that is that we have way more influence and sway over what happens locally than we do at the presidential level. Even thinking about, okay, can I talk to my neighbors who live in the same school district about the different school board candidates and who's going to be better for our community and for our kids than others? Yes, that's going to have more impact than trying to talk to a bunch of people about who they vote for president. Not that that's not important, but there you have the electoral college considerations and all these things. So, and I love what you said too about what happens in our house. We have more control over it than what happens in the White House. So, John, if people want to follow you and hear more of your insight and wisdom, perhaps even on a daily basis, where can they go to do that?
Yeah, I mean, that's funny. There was a little snarkiness in there that I sensed there, Marcy.
Hey, I tune in.
Hey, you and I go way back. But
Yeah.
Listen, I lead an organization called the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, named after Chuck Colson. And one of the things he started years ago, in fact, I remember first listening to it on the radio, was Breakpoint. It's a daily commentary about what's happening in the culture, trying to bring an analysis that is grounded in truth, but also with this idea that Christians aren't just people who believe the right things, but we live out what we believe. And so that continues on as a daily commentary. You can catch it on radio. You can also subscribe to it on podcasts, wherever you download podcasts. You can find it, Apple, Spotify, everywhere in between. Or you can go to breakpoint.org and sign up to get the email, and you can get an email of it sent to you every day, which a lot of people do as well.
Yep, it's great just for being able to stay informed. They're usually on a daily basis, really short, 1 to 5 minutes, and then you do a longer one on Fridays. That's helpful too, just kind of a roundup of things that are happening. So definitely encourage people to check that out. John, thanks so much for being with us today and for all that you do to help us think well about these
Well, I
things.
appreciate you guys. Thanks so much. It was great to be on with you.
Yep.
Thanks again for listening to Dear Jane.
You can follow along every day on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and X. And make sure you also are subscribed so you never miss an episode on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, as well as YouTube. Ring that bell so you're notified and you never miss an episode.